Well, it is a delight to be with you this morning. I am really excited to have so many folks back again. I'll give a confession at the very beginning. A month ago when I had asked Scott to preach last Sunday and then people showed up, I was just a little bit jealous there, Scott. But it's just great seeing you all back again, and it is a delight to have you here. There's nothing quite like being a part of the fellowship here. For those of you who are online, as you're ready, we welcome you back too. We'd be glad to have you here. Justin, thanks for messing up just a little bit at the beginning, because if you came to church this morning thinking, I'm awkward coming there because that's probably just a bunch of people who are either perfect or think they're perfect, okay? You're going to discover that we're not, and we take great hope in that. Here's why. Because in the gospel record we see this morning, you're going to discover the people in the Bible weren't either, okay? Peter says some things that are really off the wall. You almost want to say to the Apostle Peter, it'd be great if you just stay quiet for a little bit, okay? Jesus is the only one who's perfect, but everybody else, including us, are not. So if you came in this morning a little reticent, saying, I don't know, coming back to church, what's that going to be like? Or if you're online thinking that same thought, I just want to tell you, the Bible is full of imperfect people. And we are rejoicing that we can be together because of what Christ has done. Okay, 3 words that are going to walk you through the text this morning. Take your Bibles and open up with me to Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8. And we're at the end of that chapter, actually, down about verse 27 is where we're going to pick up the reading. But the 3 words I want you to think about this morning are these 3 words: confession, declaration, confirmation, okay? Confession. Now, when you think of the word confession, you might think that you're confessing a sin. Actually, the word is a Greek word, homologeo, which is homa, the same, legeo, to speak the same about something. So that's why we use it regarding sin. We say that when we confess our sins, we're saying, Lord, I'm not defending this anymore. I acknowledge you called it a sin. I'll call it a sin. But the confession that Peter makes in this passage is calling Jesus the Christ, the Messiah. He is saying the same thing about Jesus that Jesus would have said about Jesus, okay? So that's the idea that you find there with the word confession. The word declaration are 3 statements God the Father makes about his Son. And those were challenging. Even though I thought I knew them, I suddenly was, in reflecting upon them, was thinking, wow, I don't think I quite understood what God meant when he said, this is my Son whom I love, all right? So we'll unpack that in a second. And then finally, confirmation. Jesus confirms that he is who he says he is because he does a miracle when nobody else can. But we also find something confirming about our faith in the end of that. So that's where we're heading this morning. Confession, declaration, confirmation. Let's talk about confession first of all. I'll pick up the reading in verse 27 of Mark chapter 8. And Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him, I'm adding this, on behalf of the other disciples, you are the Christ. And he strictly charged them not to tell no one about him. Now, if you're familiar with this passage, you know that Matthew goes into a little bit more detail, right? Matthew has a conversation going back and forth between Peter. And I love Mark's conciseness here. Mark just says, here's what happened, and this is it, okay? And we notice 3 things, and this is beautiful because this confession, particularly when Jesus says, who do you say that I am, is something that isn't only for the disciples, but it's for all of us. You and I have to answer that question, okay? And you have to answer that question whether you're 9 years old or whether you're 90 years old. You have to answer what is meant by who do you say that I am? So let me give you 3 words that work with the confession, that your choices, your thinking, your commitment. And notice again, here's the text. Verse 29, he says, and he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him and said, you are the Christ. Now, let me stop there for a second. They were traveling up to Caesarea Philippi. This is a really important part in the narrative of the gospel story. Jesus has been having this huge public ministry up and around the Sea of Galilee. Thousands have come. We've already seen that. 4,000 were fed. 5,000 were fed. Lots of people, lots of miracles, lots of people. But this is a window in his ministry where he goes about 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee into a rural area called the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and he's away from the crowds, and this is intentional. Because from here on out, Jesus just wants to hang with the 12 disciples. And the reason for that is he knows he's got to tell them a whole slew of times, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to rise from the dead, and they're just going to look at him and say, what's this about? Okay? So he moves away from the crowds and he addresses them personally. By the way, in this context, you and I have to answer this question. Our choices, are we identifying Jesus properly? Are we identifying Jesus properly? Now, Peter says, who do we believe that you are? We believe that you are the Christ. Now, for a moment, stop there. If you grew up here in the West or in America, you probably think in terms of a first name and a last name. And so you would have thought Jesus is his first name, Christ is his last name, okay? But that's not how it was in biblical times, right? Jesus was his name, meaning God is salvation, the Lord is salvation. Christ was the title, meaning he was the Messiah. It's a translation of the Hebrew word for Messiah, or anointed one, meaning he is the one that is set apart. We sung this morning of the holy God. Jesus is the one who is that. Okay? Peter recognizes him as that and then kind of flips and starts to tell him what he should do, even though you'll see that in your thinking in a second. But what I want you to see is you must first identify Jesus properly. And you can say, well, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, okay? But can I ask you, do you really believe that in such a way that you're living that? In the mountains there, where Caesarea Philippi is, there were these carved out areas. You can kind of see them here in the image. And that's because in those carved out areas, you can't see them now because they've been taken, were all of these idols that had been placed there where people were worshiping the idols, okay? So just picture Jesus standing there saying to Peter and the disciples, and who do you say that I am? And all around him are these idols. Okay? You say, well, that's not my problem, Phil. I'm not an idol worshiper. I don't have an idol in my house. That's not the issue. Do you potentially have an idol here? Okay. Like, I'll just give you some of them. In our world that's upside down, do you long for security and safety more than you long for Christ? If you're a high school student or junior high student, do you desire the popularity that some have more than bearing the name of Christ? If you're working, do you desire the next pay grade or the next step up? Is that what consumes your thoughts and your mind? Because you can almost put your own idols in those little boxes there on the side of the mountain and hear Christ say, and who do you say that I am? That's the picture. That's why we call it your choices. Are you identifying Jesus properly? Here's the second part, and this was one of the most revolutionary thoughts in the scriptures to me years ago. You're thinking, are you thinking like God or like man? And in fact, I'm going to quote this section from the New American Standard because I like the way that it captures the last portion. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Okay? Now just picture this, okay? These men have been following Jesus. They've seen massive miracles. They've seen him walk on water. They've seen all this stuff. And all of a sudden, here he is saying, oh, by the way, I'm going to die. And you understand why they wouldn't believe it, okay? And he was stating the matter plainly. That's no parables here. He's just telling them, right? And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Okay, now, here's the thing. You never want to rebuke Jesus, right? That's the thing. And Peter forgot that. You'll see why in a second, because Jesus tells him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. Now, stop for a second, okay? In Matthew's account, Jesus had just renamed Peter. He said, Simon, I'm going to call you Petros. I'm going to call you Peter. Now he renames him again, okay? You say, well, man, Peter must have a serious identity problem going on, right? But he explains why. For you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's. You are not thinking like God, Peter. You're thinking like a man. Now, stop there for a second and get a hold of this, right? This temptation that Jesus has to go to the cross, die for the sins of man, even though he's just said that, okay? This temptation is so real that Jesus doesn't even mess with it. He says, Peter, get behind me, Satan. I don't want to be tempted by this. For you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. You say, well, how was he thinking? Okay, this is so appropriate for 2021. Here it is. Jesus had been teaching them, look at what was before. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed. And Peter said, no, Lord, not you. And Jesus says to him, listen, that's how a man thinks. A man thinks that suffering has no purpose. Like, that's why we are so concerned about safety and buckling up our kids and thinking that we can control something if we do all of that. Hold on for a second. I'm not saying we shouldn't in wisdom, but I am saying a reliance on that is got to be wrong. Okay? The fact that you might say, well, I know we'll all be safe now, we won't have to suffer now, misses the point that throughout the scriptures, difficulty and suffering comes, and God doesn't avoid it. Sometimes he plunges us right into it. And that's why Romans 5 says, we rejoice in our sufferings. Why? Because suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. Character produces hope. You want to lose hope? You want to lose character? You want to lose endurance? Then just try to be suffering free. Okay? In fact, this is such a foreign concept to the disciples, and probably for this reason. They wanted a conquering Messiah who would drive out Rome. Okay, that's where they were. They got a humble Messiah who would die in their place. Just picture this. You're starting the path to Jerusalem. Jesus is moving towards Jerusalem here over the next few months. And he is saying, I just want to be really clear on this. You guys think I'm going to conquer Rome and kick them out of here so you can have your own country again? Here's what you need to know. I'm going to go down there and die. Okay? And I'm going to do that for you. Remarkable. Your choices, are you identifying Jesus properly? Your thinking, are you thinking like God or like man? This is just a great, I don't know, let me just say this. Like when someone starts to talk to you, particularly a believer, okay? Particularly a believer, just ask them this question. You think you're thinking like God or are you thinking like a man? Because God has different purposes in our circumstances, and we just are so circumstance avoidance. Difficulty avoidance. Now watch this, because Jesus drives that part home even further. Look with me as you begin to read in Mark chapter 8, verse 34. And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if any would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Now, we live in a world where we've kind of interpreted the cross metaphorically, okay? So I get that. We tend to think of, well, that's my cross to bear, okay? I got to get up. Maybe you're a student. You say, I got to go to the early morning classes. I scheduled my college classes, and I got to go to an 8 o'clock class. That's my cross to bear, okay? I just want to tell you, there was nothing metaphorical about it back here, okay? This was Jesus talking about a cross when he just said he was going to go to Jerusalem and die. And you can almost picture the disciples saying, Jesus, if you want to talk like that, that's okay, but I'm not sure I want in on that, okay? I didn't think this was what this was about. And what Jesus is saying is, will you follow me when it's difficult? Will you do the things I ask you to do even when it's difficult? And look at verse 35, for whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. Literally, are you willing to give up what you want, what your desires are? Are you willing to give that up? Jesus says, for me. Okay, that's the point. In fact, in Galatians chapter 2, we see this. Paul interprets it this way. He says, I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Paul says, I'm willing to crucify my desires because Jesus matters that much. So just let these thoughts kind of settle in. When it comes to confession, that is, we believe that Jesus was who he said he was. It affects our choices, it affects our thinking, and it affects our commitment. Here's your second word, declaration. You say, okay, Phil, that's a heavy message, and I just came, to feel good about church like this morning, and you just told me I should feel the weight of that. Yes, you should, because what Christ did for you should change that. But you're about to find some really amazing hope. Watch this. Declaration, we're going to talk about three things the Father declared about his Son at the Transfiguration. Let me just read that text to you, and here we go, chapter 9, verse 1. And he said, "Truly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power." Now, if you're reading that, you're thinking, well, wait a minute. All those disciples died. So Jesus hasn't returned yet, so what is he talking about? Well, I think the context tells you that what he's talking about is when he is transfigured, literally glorified temporarily, they are going to see the kingdom of God in its power. 3 of them, not all of them, but 3 of them. It's obviously referencing what's following. Verse 2, and after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. Okay, now the biblical writer is just trying to say, this is the brightest light you can possibly imagine, right? Jesus has changed. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, "Peter, you should just keep your mouth shut." But he speaks anyhow. Here it comes. "Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Okay, this is a great lesson. If you're scared, don't talk, okay? Because you're about to say something really stupid, okay? Peter looks at Jesus and says, you guys all kind of look alike. You're all kind of glowing. So Elijah, Moses, Jesus, you guys are all like the same. But he just said, you are the Christ, you're the Messiah, you're the anointed one. And then he tried to correct him. So now Peter's just kind of bumbling over himself. And you can almost picture James and John saying, "Peter, shut up, okay? Don't say anything anymore. You're making a fool of yourself." Okay, but let's keep reading. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." And suddenly looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them but Jesus only. Let me give you 3 things that the Father declares. The Father declared that he loved his Son. Okay? That's why the text says, "This is my beloved Son." Now, when you first read that, you just kind of go right over it, because you're probably thinking everybody loves their kids, right? The word beloved here is the Greek word, the base of it is the Greek word agape, which the Bible uses to describe a sacrificial love. What God the Father is saying here is, this is my Son, and I love him so much that I would give up anything for him. That's sacrifice. That's the agape sacrificial love. Just let this thought settle in. The Father is saying, this is my beloved Son. This is the Son that I love. This is the Son, Peterson translates it, that is marked by my love. This is the Son that I love so much that I will give up anything for him. You ready? And I am about to give him up for you. Wow. It was a couple months ago that it started to occur to me that we tend to think of sacrifice as giving our life up. Like that's the greatest sacrifice. That's not the greatest sacrifice for a parent. Almost every parent I know would say, particularly if they've lost a child, would say, I would have rather given up my life than let my child die. Every parent, every time I watch a parent lose a child, even whether young or whether they're in their 30s, my heart just hurts and aches, because that is the ultimate sacrifice, greater even than giving up your own life. God says, this is the Son I love. I love him so much I would give anything on his behalf, but I am giving him to you instead. This is my beloved Son. Now, he not only said that, but he also said this. The Father declared that he was pleased with the Son. Now, you don't find that here in Mark, because Mark abbreviates everything. But in Matthew, chapter 17, verse 5, you read this. He was still speaking. Behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Okay. You say, well, why was the Father pleased? I was thinking about that, and it was actually something that I stumbled on that G. Campbell Morgan, who was the pastor at Westminster Chapel in London, said years ago. He pointed out the fact, are you ready for this? That Jesus was temporarily glorified. Luke says that Moses and Elijah are actually talking to him about his departure, okay? Now, just think about this for a second. Now, look at your text and look at verse 31. Here, Mark 8:31. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders. Then you see the transfiguration in verse 2, and he's talking to Moses and Elijah about his departure. And then look at Mark chapter 9, verse 31, where he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. I think it's fair to assume, like G. Campbell Morgan did, that Jesus is glorified. They're talking to him about his departure, and you have to know there must at least have been the temptation in Jesus' mind that said, I just talked about the cross, I'm going to talk about it again. Wow, it sure would be nice to go to heaven now. And leave all of these people behind that, that really aren't going to follow me when I get to the cross anyhow. I think there is a moment here where the temptation of Christ may have been, can I just take the shortcut? And I think the reason the Father is well pleased is because when Moses and Elijah leave, there is Jesus, who said, I decided to stay. Now, we know that Jesus struggles with that, and not in a sinful way, but in a tempting way, because he's in the Garden of Gethsemane saying, Lord, is there another way? Father, is there another way? But not my will, but yours be done. And I want you to see that the pleasure of the Father rests upon Jesus, because Jesus makes the choice to stay, to suffer, to die for us. Father declares that he was well pleased with the Son. Here's the last one. The Father declared that we should believe and obey the Son. The Father declared that we should believe and obey the Son. In fact, look at Mark chapter 9, back again, verse 7. This is my beloved Son. Remember, Matthew inserts there, with whom I am well pleased. But Mark adds, listen to him. Now, for just a moment, understand the word listen, okay? I've mentioned this before, but the Bible doesn't have a huge distinction between listening and obeying. It has this idea that I just had an illustration run into my head, so I'm about to share it, so that's why I stumbled there for a second, okay? It has this idea that when we genuinely say, I listened, we obey. The word listen here is the Greek word akuo. The word obey is the word hupa akuo, literally to hupa under, to listen under, which means I'm listening with the intention of obeying. That's why we say here that the Father declared that we should believe and obey the Son. He says to the disciples, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. Literally believe and obey. And we say that because there's this verbal expression. The moods of the Greek language allow you to have 4 different moods. 2 of them specifically are used the most. The indicative and the imperative. The indicative is a statement of fact, a truth statement. Jesus made many of those. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you, okay? So we believe those kinds of statements. But he also gives us commands to obey. Those are imperatives. So we have things that we believe and we have things that we should do. And that's how we reveal our faith. We both believe and we do. Scott did a great job of expressing that last week. You may remember where he started to unpack 1 John. These are the things you do. That doesn't get you saved. But your obedience, your heartfelt and joyful obedience reveals that you really do have faith. It's not enough to say, sure, I believe that. I'm going to do whatever I want. The Father declared that we should believe and obey the Son. And that's why he says, listen to him. Years ago, I had a friend of mine who was a grandfather, and he said he saw his grandson, who was about 5 years old, muttering to himself at the flower box at the backyard and clipping off all the heads of his wife's tulips, okay, with the scissors, just snap, 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 and he was muttering to himself. And so he came up alongside of him, wondering why he was talking to himself, and he heard a tap, 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 tap on the window, and Grandma was inside tapping on the window, and he heard the little boy say, I hear you, but I'm not listening, snip. I hear you, but I'm not listening, snip. I hear you, but I'm not listening, because Grandma was inside saying, do you hear me? Do you hear me? I hear you, but I'm not listening. I hear you, but I'm not listening, okay? That is so typical of so many of us as Christians, that we say, I know God said that, but if listening means obeying, I'm not going to. All right, so just by way of reminder, those are the 3 words. The Father declared these things. He declared he loved his Son. The Father declared that he was pleased with his Son. The Father declared that he would believe, that we should believe and obey the Son. One last word, confirmation. Now, there's 2 things that are going to get confirmed in Matthew chapter 9, okay? But before we get there, well, I'll just give it to you in a summary form. In Matthew chapter 9, after they come down off the mountain, there is a boy that the father comes to Jesus. You probably remember the story, and says, will you heal my son? Your disciples have tried. They've been ineffective. Now picture this. 3 disciples are with Jesus on top of the mountain. They come down the mountain. As they come down the mountain, here's the other 9 disciples trying to cast a demon out of this boy, but they can't do it, right? And the father, you probably have heard this phrase before, says, I do believe, help my unbelief, okay? Now, for just a moment, understand the first part of this. The miracle confirms that Jesus was like no other. In other words, we confirm that the one that Peter called the Christ, back in Mark chapter 8, the one that the Father said, this is my beloved Son, this miracle now confirms that. Because Jesus does a miracle that nobody else can do, right? And when he says this only comes out by prayer, and some translations add the word fasting there, it almost makes it sound like you guys didn't pray hard enough or long enough, but Jesus gets it done just like that. Okay? And the miracle confirms that Jesus was like no other. When we sung this morning, we sung of the Holy God. He is the one who is set apart. But the miracle confirms that Jesus was like no other, but our faith confirms our need of a Savior. Now, just for a moment, think with me. If I were to compare 2 people for you in this passage, the disciples, okay, and the father of this child who is demon-possessed and is mute and dumb, and has seizure tendencies. If I were to compare 2 people, and I would say, who's got greater faith? Okay, you would probably think, let's see, the disciples have fed 5,000 people, and their 5,000 men and their wives and kids, maybe 10,000 people. The disciples have seen that. They've seen Jesus walk on water. They've done miracles themselves. They have to have the greater faith, right? And this man who says, I do believe, but help my unbelief, doesn't seem to have as much faith, right? Ready for this? When you read this passage, that's exactly backwards. It's the disciples that don't have the faith. It's the Father that does. You say, well, wait a minute, but he's the one who said, help my unbelief. Let me show you that in the text. We reveal our need for faith when we come to God just as we are, unable to even help ourselves. We reveal our need for faith when we come to God just as we are, unable to even help ourselves. That's right. That's the greatest way that we reveal our faith. We don't try to get there on our own. We don't try to get it done on our own. We don't try to be good enough on our own. We just come saying, Lord, this is all I am. Right? In fact, one writer has said, the man said, if you can, help me. And the Lord rebuked him, the first phrase. And so with tears, the Father said, then help me just as I am a doubter. I love that. We read, I do believe, help my unbelief. But this person translated it, then help me just as I am a doubter. The man was not praying that his unbelief might be helped till it came to the point where it was worthy of meeting with the response from God. Instead, he was asking for practical help and confessing, deeply moved, that he had nothing to make him worthy of it. Look at the text real quickly. Verse 21, and Jesus asked the Father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood, and it has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. Imagine a parent's grief there. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, okay, all things are possible for the one who believes. Now, right there, it almost sounds like that you just got to believe more, and then God will respect your belief. But listen, we do not manipulate God with our belief. That's not the point of this. The point of this is that this man said, I recognize I don't believe enough. Remember how I started this morning by saying if you came into church thinking everybody's perfect, then you did not understand that sitting in the pews all around you are people who from time to time have had doubts and maybe even have them right now. It's not that we are without doubt. It's that we say, Lord, will you take me where I am? In fact, I love the way one writer talked about it. He said, the Father asked Jesus to heal him first. He was aware that he was an imperfect being. Whatever is in me, Lord, that does not believe or want to believe, heal that first. That's what's meant by, I do believe, help my unbelief. For one moment, the father totally loses track of his son. Just picture that. I do believe, help my unbelief. In other words, he's praying to Jesus, Jesus, will you restore my belief? Okay. And Jesus does the miracle, just like that. If you today say, Phil, I just got questions and I got doubts, but I do believe, I just want to tell you, God isn't waiting on you to have perfect faith. He is telling you, listen, right where you are, I can increase your faith. I can do that. You don't have to do that to actually come to me. He reaches this man as a doubter where he is, and he heals him, and he causes him to believe, and then he heals his son. Now, remember how I said that the disciples, we would think, had strong faith, and this man, we would think, would have weak faith. But in truth, this man had the kind of faith that God honored. Accept me where I am, Lord. I can't get to you. Okay. Look at the disciples. We reveal our lack of faith. We reveal our need for faith when we come to God just as we are. We reveal our lack of faith when we operate independently of God. We don't see the need to ask for help. Let me show you why that is. Here's the reason for faith, okay? The reason for faith is we in our brokenness desire independence from God. Seriously. That's it. In our brokenness, we in our brokenness desire independence from God, but God in his faithfulness requires that we trust him. The essence of your faith is not that you could impress God with it, but rather God says, listen, throughout all your life, you're going to keep trying to do this on your own. And I'm just going to tell you, you're broken. You need to acknowledge you're broken. You need to acknowledge you're not perfect. You need to acknowledge you're imperfect. You need to acknowledge that you got challenges and you got sins that you repeat. And I recognize your brokenness. And you keep fighting for your independence because you just want to be independent. But God says, listen, the only way I'm going to correct this is I will be faithful, but you'll need to trust me that I will be faithful. Such a remarkable thing. It's why Hebrews says, for faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the confidence of things not seen. We keep looking for things we can see that we want to hold on to, and we keep saying, if I can see that, I know I can do it. I can do it on my own. That's not how it works. The Christian message is that you and I were broken, and that we keep desiring independence, even in our brokenness. But God, in his faithfulness, requires that we trust him. We desire, he requires. And that brings you to the disciples. Here it is. We reveal our lack of faith when we operate independently of God. We don't see the need to ask for help. And for the first time, when I was thinking through this passage, I understood why Jesus said at the end, the disciples, you may remember, come to him privately. Look at it. Mark chapter 9, verse 28. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately. Remember, they couldn't cast the demon out. Why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. I remember when I used to read that, I used to think, well, they just didn't pray enough. The truth of the matter is, they probably didn't pray at all, okay? Because they weren't asking God for help like the Father was asking God for help. In fact, Rodney Cooper says, Jesus had given the disciples authority to cast out demons. Why then could they not cast this one out? Because they were relying on their own power. They were relying on the fact that Jesus had given them authority, but he had not given it to them apart from God. They needed to rely on God. That's why Jesus says in John 15, apart from me, you can do nothing. And here's the moment. You can see it, right? That the man who said, I do believe, but I can't even help my unbelief. Will you help me? Jesus answered. And the disciples who said, we got this, okay? We got this. I mean, just for a moment, imagine this. Jesus has been up on the mountain with James, John, and Peter. The Father brings the Son, and he says, listen, I got a son who's demon-possessed. Can you do something? The disciples are doing everything they can to cast the demon out, and nothing works, okay? This is just my imagination, but I can picture it kind of went like this. Hey, Matthew, what were you doing when you were down in Galilee? How did you cast him out? Well, this is how I cast him out. Well, why don't you try that? It's not working for me, okay? They're all talking about how they can do it, and none of them can do it because not one of them asked God for help. Okay? How much is that like us? We face something that's difficult, God, and it's beyond us. And we keep trying, we keep laboring, we keep trying to think of a way to fix it. And God himself says, will you trust me in this? Have you called out to me in this? Have you prayed to me in this? Have you submitted to me in this? It's almost humorous in a sense. You'll notice in the text that the disciples do not ask that question in public, okay? Which shows, again, their dependence on themselves. They wait till they get alone in a house and say, hey, we got a question for you, Jesus, okay? How did you cast him out and we couldn't? That's automatically the mark of pride. Like, we didn't ask you out there because we already knew we'd failed and we didn't want anybody to say, hey, I didn't make the team. Okay, like I got cut today. Like, they didn't want to admit that until they get private, and Jesus says, listen, here's the thing. This kind comes only out by prayer. Why didn't you just ask? 3 words we're reminded of. Here they are. Confession, declaration, confirmation. Which one of those do you need today? Maybe to just say again, I believe that Jesus is the Christ and I'm turning my back on my idols. Maybe you need declaration, the fact that you need to remember that God loved his son sacrificially so much that he would give anything for him, and yet he gave him for you. Right? Or maybe you just need to understand that your true, genuine faith is confirmed when you call out to God as you are, not as you think you should be or as you hope you should be, but trusting God fully. This is a lesson for everyone who is imperfect. Wherever you are in that status, just know this. God longs to take you as you are. We simply ask him to help us where we are. Father, it's been a privilege to look to your word this morning. We are grateful for the example of Jesus. We're grateful for the failures of the disciples because we find encouragement that we don't need to be perfect to please you. We're thankful, Lord, for the father of a son who just cried out and acknowledged he was a doubter, but said, this is who I am. Will you heal me right now? And you did. You took away his doubts. You helped his unbelief. Lord, I pray you would do that for us as well. Help us not come to you hoping to impress you. Help us to come to you dependent, humbling, realizing we're not what we should be in our brokenness, but we know that you sent your son to bring about our healing, to bring about our salvation. Help us to trust you, not ourselves. In Jesus' name.